also, as Erik was going to talk about Hypermedia, I'm actually going to try to sell you on Hypermedia, and I'm going to do that by picking out one single advantage that I think is specific to Hypermedia, which is that it has a good story on API inclusion. Now, but first something about myself. Yeah, that's correct. So I spent about half of my time on GoBout, which is a small startup, and we make what you would probably think of as a trip planner, but actually we think of as a marketplace for urban transport or mobility as a service. It means simply that when you plan your trip from HP, we not only tell you how to go, but we can also book the trip and let you pay for the trip. So it's, you tell us where you want to go, and we will arrange that for you. So that's about half of my time. And the other half of my time is spent on other projects, most of them, or many of them, in the context of payment software. And we do continuous delivery and agile change management and all that boring stuff. So that's me. And today, like I said, I wanted to talk to you about Hypermedia. I'm first going to talk a bit why this API evolution is important, and specifically about backwards compatibility. I'm going to talk about Hypermedia and HAL, give my personal introduction to that, and then I'm going to tell you how that will help you with API evolution. So, if I had a motto, it would probably be this: design for change. Now when I created these slides, I created a couple of slides where I wanted to tell you why this is good, design for change, agile, stuff like that, but I think we all do this, right? We all use the methodologies, so we all use, this one. We all use the tools. We don't prematurely create beautiful architectures, just enough architecture, just enough design. We do domain-driven design to stay close to our problem domain. We do testing, all this good stuff. Now, Facebook's move fast and break things is probably the strongest way of expressing this. And of course, the goal is not necessarily to break things, but you can't deny that agile processes err on the side of getting something into production instead of getting the perfect thing into production. And of course that means you do need to fix your mistakes. Maybe they are simply a typo. Maybe it is something that you thought you wanted, but turns out you really don't want it. Or it's just that the world is changing, and so your API also needs to change. So breakage and dealing with breakage is central to developing with agile processes. Now, of course, we all know how to deal with that. For example, if it's internal code, we will use refactoring. If it's our data store, we will use data migration scripts. We know how to do this. With external code, we use version numbers. And especially if you use semantic versioning, these numbers mean very specific things. Namely, I would call these the oh crap, shiny and oops numbers. But for an API, we don't really have a story. But for APIs, we don't really have a story. And that's really a problem, because when we are afraid of breaking backward compatibility, that means we start to think long and hard before we put anything into production. Big design up front, and this will lead to long release cycles. Long release cycles and these really awkward version numbers, right? So API versioning. It's not only a problem that these URLs are ugly, but the main problem is that usually these APIs are upgraded wholesale, right? So you need to use the new API, and everything you've programmed and learned, you can often throw that away, and you need to use a whole new API. Yeah. So this is why having a good story on API inclusion, on breakage, on backward compatibility is important. And I think Hypermedia has a great story there. Now, in order to tell that story, of course, I have to tell you what I think Hypermedia is. So I'm going to do a quick introduction. And I'm going to speed up this a bit more because you already saw Eric's presentation. If I'm going too fast, a very good way of slowing me down is to raise your hand and ask a question. So let's start modeling something, right? Let's start modeling this. This is a ship. So what can you say about the ship? It has an identity. So it's an entity. And this means it's a resource. Its identity is a URI, a universal resource identifier. Now this resource has one or more representations in a specific media type, and in this case it's JSON. And the first image is, well, basically the image representation of the same resource, which is the ship. So this is about syntax, right? It's JSON, it's syntax, but it doesn't say anything about what the thing is. And so you would also add some kind of typing information. And in Hypermedia, you call this a profile. Now, some people don't like profiles. They say they're not necessary. But I think that people are just used to thinking in types or classes or categories or what you want to call them. And it's just useful to have this as a first class idea, concept when you design your API. So we have a type, a profile, and to bring this all together, we get a representational state, which is a resource of certain type that can be represented with a media type as this string. Now we're almost at our beloved acronym REST, so let's add the last one, it's transfer. So if the URI, if the identifier is a URL, an HTTP URL, you can also manipulate this entity, this ship. You can get it, and you can put it, you can delete it. And so what you have here is you are going to model the ship and everything around it that you want to be able to do to this ship in sort of like a prox model, like process, read, upsert, and delete. And usually it is a C because posts are often used to create new resources. And so what you really get is you model your business logic as state manipulation. So we have the ship. And now a ship, of course, has an owner, which is probably also a resource, but these two have a relation, right? So a ship has an owner. And so to do that in Hypermedia, we need what's called a reference. And a reference is just to mention the URI you want to refer to. Now the easiest way to refer to something is just to put it in a property, right? So this is what the GitHub API does. They just put URLs in properties that they return in JSON. And this is a perfectly valid way to linking resources. The interesting thing is that, so why would a client know that to find the owner of a ship, they would need to have this owner href property? Well, it would be defined by the profile. So in this case, the profile, the type of the resource defines the relation to other resources. But there's another way to linking resources together, and that's using what's called links. And that's when you don't define these links in the profile, in the type of the resource, but you pull it out and make it its own thing. The concept of having a relation to another resource. And what would that look like? That would look like this. So you would say a resource has a specific relation to another resource. And if you think, well, this looks familiar, this looks like an RDF trigger, and yes, it does. Yes. So this is the same linking that they talk about when they say the linked web or something like that. Now, in order to do this, it's useful to have a media type that has these links in it, and like Eric also showed you, HAL is, I think, a great hypermedia resource or a media type to use. So, what would this ship that we saw be like? What would it look like in HAL? In HAL, look a bit like this. So you start with the state, the properties of the ship itself. It's the information of the ship. Then you add links to the other resources. Like Eric said, the self link refers to the resource itself. The profile refers to the profile, the type of the resource. And we have one resource here, one link here that links to the owner of the ship. And now we have one extra thing that we also talked about, which is the idea of embedding other resources. And so we could also embed the owner if the server thought, well, if you access a ship, you will probably want to know something about the owner. You can just embed the owner in the resource.
Why is the owner represented as a URL?
What do you mean by represented by URL?
Yeah, the key of owner.
Yes, that's because the relation between the ship and the owner is this URI. So this is the same URI as in the previous slide, right? So on the bottom, the owner relation is exactly the same URI. So a good hypermedia client works with this, with the embedded representation or without the embedded representation.
Yeah, but why isn't the key of that embedded or link thing just owner instead of the URL?
Ah, right. That's a good question. You can. There are plain keywords, but they only registered keywords in the IANA, the Internet Naming Authority, has a list of plain keywords, and you can use those. And if you want to register plain keywords, you have to basically write an RC. And if you want to have your own relations, you use a URI, basically only to namespace. It's just like XML namespaces are also URIs.
Okay, I'm wondering because we don't do this. We just use owner.
Okay. So that's a perfectly rational thing to do. It's officially against the spec, but it's everyone does it. So no problem. So the only advantage of doing this is that you can make sure that this resolves to an HTML documentation about the relation. And that means that if you don't know what this means, you can just open a browser, go to this URL, and then you have the user documentation of what this relation means.
And it doesn't mess up if you have, for instance, two companies with two different products coming together.
Yes, exactly.
You namespace by URL. Yeah. So it isn't obvious then if you would use the key owner and somebody else used the key owner with a different type of model behind it, you would have an issue.
Exactly. Yes.
And what if your company domain name changes or something like that? Like it's so fancy, right? Like all your clients have all these URLs in them. All of a sudden, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think if you make it part of your business logic, you better keep the domain.
So it's just a name. It doesn't have to refer to anything.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Is there a reason why the ID of the company is not explicitly referred as an attribute of the? If you see both here and in the previous page.
Yeah.
There's never the ID itself.
Exactly.
Why?
And that's why because the self link is the identifier. It's a bit longer than you're used to, of course. So this is the identifier, right? HTTP example.com /ship/number. That is the identifier for the ship. It is also its location, in the sense that you can use it to resolve the resource. This is a feature of Hypermedia and one that you need to, some people accept them and some people just throw IDs in there anyway.
There's an idea, right? The IMO thing.
Yeah, but this is a business. This is a business identifier in the sense that you could have a typo in there, and you would have to change it. Yeah. Good questions. Anything else?
Yeah, could you import something like a schema that describes all these relations?
Some people are trying to do that, but so there's schemas are only syntactic, right? So you need some kind of semantics. You need to know what's going on. So I found that just human readable documentation. So you write the documentation for the developers who write the applications, and the applications then have code to handle the different relation types and the profile types. Yeah. But people are trying to do this. Yeah.
A bit like RDF scheme.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So now we have two resources, and maybe we can start and create an API out of this. For example, a ship registry that lists ships and their owners. And the way these APIs are called, they're called HTML. No one can pronounce this, I'm afraid. But it simply means that instead, like I also said, instead of hard-coding URLs, you follow links from one resource to the other resource. And so the API would look a bit like this. So you start, of course you need a start URL to start at. You get a ship registry, you follow the relation that allows you to search in the ship registry. That gives you a collection of matching ships. Those ships are a collection of ships. And those ships are owned by companies, and those companies, they own collections of ships. And so you have get this network of resources. And so you immediately see that this looks very different from the way you would think about what's called a Rails-style REST interfaces, where you document and you think about URI endpoints. So what are the elements of a Hypermedia API? It's a media type, sometimes more media types, a set of relations, a set of profiles, and a URI to the root resource. And that's it. That's what you need to know to use a Hypermedia API. And this looks a lot like a protocol, which has a lot of interesting, means a lot of interesting things like extensibility and stuff like that. All stuff that I'm not going to talk about today, but are very interesting. So if you design a good Hypermedia client, first of all, you need to know about these things, right? And then there's two other rules. One, you will treat your URIs like they're opaque. You will not try to interpret them. And you will let these links between the different resources drive the interaction. So now you know what I think that the Hypermedia is. So then, what about backwards compatibility? Now, in order to say something about backwards compatibility, we need to know what we mean by backwards compatibility. And so I will introduce two rules that I want my clients to follow in order to manage this breakage, to have control breakage. The first rule is that clients must ignore all properties that they don't understand. And this is, well, this seems like a pretty innocent rule, but it has a couple of implications. And the first implication is that, of course, a server may return more properties in the GET response than the client knows how to handle. But it also means that if you have an old client, this client will maybe put resources that have fewer properties in them that the server currently handles. And that means you have to have some kind of story about what happens with the properties that are not set when you do a put request, because they say that put is a complete representation of a resource. It's not like fetch where you modify something. So that brings us to what's called like partial goods. And I think, I'm afraid we won't avoid this. You need to specify whether to set missing properties to the previous value, which is my preference, or you set them to some kind of default value. So already with this one seemingly noxious rule, we have some interesting interchange here. But what is really important is that removing and changing properties is absolutely not enough. This is backwards incompatibility that we will not allow. This is our promise to clients. Yeah.
What do you mean by previous value? If we have some new entity?
Yeah, so then you need to